Morning, prompt arrivers. I know you're there. I'm just going to give it another minute or so to let others join, and then we'll get started. Okay, well, good morning. Good morning, everyone. It's 2 minutes past by my clock, so let's get started. So welcome to what can sometimes feel like the mystery of bidding for contracts and tenders within the public sector. This is one of a number of webinars we're running under the Hounslow Fit to Bid programme, and it's all about helping you as local businesses improve your knowledge and experience of the tendering process. There are a number of webinars, as I say, they're all recorded if you've missed previous ones, but this one is all around public sector bidding and tendering. We've got about an hour, we've got a reasonable amount to get through. It's an interactive event. For those of you who know me, you'll know that I'm old-fashioned and I like to write things down, so I'd encourage you to do the same. And the other thing I'll also ask you to do is make a commitment to yourself to take some action. Do something as a result of what you hear in the next hour or so, because I want this to be something that's productive for you and that something positive happens as a result. And I'll ask you at the end what that one action is, if you're able to share it. Usual form, if you've got any questions, pop them in the chat and we'll try and answer them as I go along, and we'll also have a little bit of time at the end. Okay, so just a little bit about Branduin. My name's Nosher Desai. If you don't know me, I work for Branduin. We're a business support company based in London and the Southeast. And we basically run programs like this on behalf of local authorities, chambers of commerce, growth hubs, and we operate, I guess, on a consulting type basis. We work with businesses of all sizes and shapes and experiences, right from startup through to more experienced, larger SMEs. There's about 15 or 20 of us in terms of advisors, and we all have specialist knowledge. And the other thing which we think is a little bit unique about us is that we also run our own businesses as well. So we've got a bit of technical knowledge and we've got a bit of practical experience and have faced the challenges you have as well. So hopefully can help you. This is a slide that we're quite proud of. It's taken us the best part of 12 years to put together. That's not just because I'm very poor at PowerPoint. It's essentially the range of businesses and organisations that Branduin have worked with, and they'll be very familiar names to most of you. And as I said, some interesting names, a lot of local authorities and a lot of these government-funded programmes that we run to help businesses with things like bidding and tendering and generally wider business support sort of activities. A little bit about myself. Let's condense 40 years into a minute. I really have no idea where the time all goes, but it goes quickly. So my background is banking, 30 years with Lloyds, a range of things from startups right through to international banks. But a lot of my career also, I spent heading up the government team for Lloyds in London and the Southeast, where I managed large, complex tender responses, both renewal contracts and new ones as well, local authority and central government departments. I'm an advisor with Branduin, as I said. I work on a number of these type of programs. I'm just finishing a large project with Hammersmith and Fulham, which has been running for a year like this. I've done a lot of these one-to-ones over the last couple of years, probably the best part of 200. As you can see, I'm also historically been an advisor at the British Library, and I've got a small social care business that I also run, which is good for my heart in terms of trying to give something back to the community. So, as I said, that's 40 years condensed into best part of 40 seconds. I must be having fun. So what are we going to cover in the next hour or so? We've got a reasonable amount to get through. As I said, we'll talk about public sector tenders specifically. I'll talk about terminology, which can sometimes be a little bit confusing. We'll go through the tender documents that are typically received in a tender invitation. I'll then run through a live example of an invitation to tender and the requirements, which is actually a tender that Branduin responded to and successfully won. I'll touch a little bit on evaluation methodology and meat, nothing to do with butchers. As you can tell, my jokes are like myself, old. And then we'll also look at the timeline for tenders in the public sector, which can be and are typically quite structured, but can be quite flexible and delayed for various reasons. I'll then spend some time allowing you and helping you look at your business model from the perspective of tendering. That'll become clearer as I go through the process. And we'll look at things like what jobs the local authority need to get done. This is an interactive session to an extent. I'm a firm believer that what you put into life, you get out. So have a go in the little sessions that I'll be running. You'll give a chance to look at your own business SWOT analysis from a tendering perspective. And I also touch upon social value and consortium bidding where you can join forces. And as I said, we'll have a few minutes at the end for Q&A. So a reasonable amount to get through. So a little bit about the project, the support program that's available to you. The key thing about bidding and tendering is it's a selling exercise. It's not an administrative exercise. There's an element of admin involved in any tender, of course, and more so, in fairness, in the public sector. But treat it as a selling exercise because you're always selling yourself, you're selling your service, and you're selling your product. Because some businesses do naively perhaps think that it's just a case of filling out all the forms and you'll win the business. Unfortunately, if it were that simple, it would be I wouldn't be having this session with you here today. It's a selling exercise. We talk about how you engage with procurement departments, evaluators, because with the public sector particularly, you'll always be dealing with a procurement department. So you won't necessarily have contact with the end user within the council. So it's useful to also understand how procurement departments work, what they look for, how they evaluate. And I'll touch upon that here, but it's covered in a lot more detail in my previous bidding webinar, which was run last month. And those recordings are all on the West London Chamber YouTube channel. There's an online bid capability assessment questionnaire. It takes 5-10 minutes at the most to complete. If you haven't done that, I would encourage you to do that, because what it does, it allows us to produce a report for you showing what state of preparedness your business is in for tendering. Obviously, we talk about how to help you improve your bidding and tendering skills. And like I said, it's a sales process. So always keep that at the forefront of your mind. And finally, excuse me, we ran a Meet the Buyer session last month. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And then there are these individual tender advice sessions, which the council have paid for and sponsored for you and your business. So they're one-to-one sessions with a specialist advisor in bidding and tendering specifically, and also touching on some of the wider business issues. So if you haven't had or registered for one of those, please do that, and I'll show you how to do that at the end. So although it's quite a short program, I think it's running to the end of the month, and there's a lot of support available. So do take and make the most of those opportunities, because it'll help you with your success in bidding and tendering. So let me start by just explaining some of the differences between the public and private sector tender process. The process is not that dissimilar, but if we look at the things that are up on the screen, the public sector bits are all down the left on the first bit. So local authorities, government departments, they'll all have an annually allocated budget, which basically they have to spend. So what you'll often find within the public sector, when they're coming to the end of their financial year, at the end of March, early April, in line with the tax year, they need to spend that budget because otherwise they lose it. Whereas with the private sector, it's very much driven by requirements within the business, requirements within the sector. The public sector, of course, it's heavily regulated by legislation, by policy, by process, because it's public money, essentially, whereas the private sector, much lower restrictions. The process, like I said, in the public sector is very specified, methodical, prescriptive. It's not actually that difficult once you know what that process is. But until you do, it can feel a bit daunting. It can feel like there are a lot of forms to fill, a lot of procedure. So we'll run through that process in some detail to make sure you don't trip up at the first stage, because you have to go through each stage to progress into the next cut. And I want to make sure you're able to do that. The time period around local authority bids is quite fixed. And I'll run through a timetable for you later in a live from a live example that we bid for as a tender. Although these things can often get stretched, they can often change for a variety of reasons. Whereas with the private sector, there'll be typically one person handling the process, and it's much more flexible in terms of the actual purchasing process from the client. Public sector tenders and contracts have to be completely transparent. The government have to be, they're spending our money, they have to be objective, they have to be, dare I say, whiter than white, so if anyone challenges them, they can show that no one supplier was preferentially treated over and above another. So it has to be a very, very open process, so much so that even if one potential supplier asks a question, the local authority will share the answer with every supplier. The main motivation typically in the public sector is spending money fairly and wisely. It's our money. And if any of you watched the budget highlights yesterday, there's not a lot of our money going round because it's a tough time at the moment. So consequently, the government have to be able to account for every penny spent. So consequently, they have to be able to demonstrate they're spending money in the right way. You might think watching the news, that isn't always the case, but that's the driver, that's the strategy. Whereas the private sector, very much driven by return on investment, profit margins, shareholder value, that sort of thing. Public sector departments, particularly local authorities, you'll often be dealing with a number of different stakeholders. I touched upon earlier, you'll be talking to procurement departments. You might be touching base with the end user. You might be dealing with some specialist people within the council who are actually have an interest in the project. So you're often having to manage a number of different stakeholders, which can be quite complicated. So you need to know who those key stakeholders are. Who are the key people within the council you need to get to know, to influence, and get them to know, like, and trust you and understand a bit more about your business. Whereas private sector, there might be one person within the business who is responsible for managing the tender process. And the final point is, as I say, the focus is reducing spend and saving money, typically for the public sector, whereas the private sector, much more about increasing margins, profit, shareholder value. Those little diagrams at the bottom, which are a bit sort of unusual, or call it what you like, what those things are supposed to demonstrate, they're things that in the public sector are much more important. Things like social value, I'll touch upon that. What is your business adding to the community? How is it helping to build what's called community wealth? How do you operate in terms of the circular economy? That's things like reusing goods, recycling things, using resources more carefully. All these things are actually important to talk about in your bid submissions with the public sector. It is also an issue in the private sector, but the public sector have made it a strategically important area. So as you can see, there are some subtle differences in terms of the key drivers for public sector departments versus the private sector. So just worth thinking about that. So let's just touch briefly on some of the key issues that face SMEs trying to bid for business in the public sector. And just to be clear, this isn't something I pulled off Google. This is actual feedback that we've had from one-to-ones that we've done with businesses under these various programs. So to start with, businesses say to me, I don't really have enough experience and knowledge in the public sector. Well, let me tell you, there is a huge amount of information out there on whatever local authority you're targeting. There's information on their website. They've got obviously various social media channels. They'll have strategy papers. They'll run events. You can go and talk to people. You know, they're just like any other client. You need to build a relationship. And I accept that it takes time and effort, but there's definitely ways for you as businesses to start to get more experience within the public sector. So look at the authority you're targeting and look at their strategy papers. Look at basically what they're saying. Talk about the industry being dominated by large companies. Well, okay, that's true perhaps to a point, but like I said earlier, once they get to know you, if you provide a specialist service, they will look at you. The other alternative is to join forces. I'll talk a little bit later about consortium bidding. Businesses say to me, well, you know, my company's so small, the public sector buyers, they don't know anything about me. Well, I refer back, I suppose, to a point in my first point, which is, well, start to build relationships with public sector buyers. Certainly in this program, we'll put you in touch with the key influencers within Hounslow Council, within areas where you want to target. We'll do that during your one-to-ones. So start to build those relationships, because it's like any other client. Businesses buy from you when they know, like, and trust you. So you're right. If they don't know you, you're going to be on the back foot. Let's talk about not being able to reach the right people. As I said, we'll put you in touch with the right people. You might feel there are practical considerations that stop you tendering, like you're just too busy, you haven't got enough time, you know, you're not quite sure what the process is. Well, what I would say is plan it in advance, because if you're going to do this, do it well, because it does take some time and effort, particularly on the first time. But like anything in life which is worth getting, it's typically not that easy. I often see a lack of marketing strategy activity, and I've touched a little bit upon this, and just in terms of starting to get to know buyers and things like getting client testimonials, getting client reviews, case studies. Certainly the evaluation team within the councils, they'll always be looking for evidence of what you say you're good at or what you say you can do. So start building up that case of testimonials and reviews, because it all adds weight to you and your bid when you're submitting tenders. There's nothing to stop you doing that now. Businesses say, well, we just haven't got time. We haven't got time to plan properly. Yes, it does take a bit of time. It does take a bit of time. But, you know, in its simplest form, have an Excel spreadsheet with some timelines, with the activities listed down the left, down the vertical. I talk about this in more detail in my previous tenders, but like I say, if you plan it properly, then you're much more likely to succeed. And the last 2 points is that we don't really understand about the tendering process. We're not sure how to write strong bids, not really sure what to put in our bid responses to win tenders. Well, this is exactly what these sessions and webinars are all about. It's to help you get more experience. And I would encourage you to have a look at my first webinar if you didn't see it 3 or 4 weeks ago, because it talks about those things in a lot more detail. So that bit in the box at the bottom says, you know, we're going to talk you through some of the biggest secrets of doing business with the government. Well, they're only secrets if you don't know about them. And my role here is to tell you about as many of those tips, suggestions, best practice ideas that will then help you overcome the challenges of writing good, strong, winning tender bids. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about tender terminology. It's a little bit technical, this bit, so my apologies up front, because there is a lot of terminology in tenders, particularly the public sector, and you may have come across some or all of these. So I'll just whiz through them quickly. You can look at them in a bit more detail after if you want to. The first document you'll often see is a PQQ, or a pre-qualification questionnaire. And it's the stage 1 questionnaire, and it'll be asking some basic specific questions about your company and its insurance details. Have you worked on similar contracts? There'll be a lot of yes, no questions. They'll ask you things about fraudulent activity. Have you paid your taxes? Might seem obvious, but again, make sure you fill in every question response, even if it is a yes no question, because they'll get you through to the next stage, which is always the target. Then the key document is the ITT, or the invitation to tender, and And that's where you start to build and talk about your offer, your quality, your costings. It's where you actually price the job that needs to be done. You answer a number of technical questions about your ability to do the work in accordance with the scope, with the process that they've asked. So it's the main document, and we'll run through that in detail in a few moments. There's then what's called a request for proposal. That's very similar to an ITT, in fairness, where they assess cost and quality. But RFPs are used in situations often where the client either can't or doesn't want to define the scope of the work up front. So this means you, as a potential supplier, you need to be very descriptive and clear about what you can provide up front. An RFQ, request for quotation, again, a lot like a tender, typically smaller in size and scope, and they're often geared towards clients who are looking and seeking pricing information for a particular piece of work, a particular supply of material or equipment. And in those RFQs, you don't often need to provide a detailed proposal. And then final two areas, you may have come across the term framework agreements. And what this is, it's an agreement between one or more businesses and organizations. And if you enter and get included within a council framework agreement, you'll be contractually bound to deliver services to the council. And the final one, the dynamic purchasing system, similar to framework agreements, although it's an electronic version. That's one of the key things. And the second difference is that new suppliers can join at any time the dynamic purchasing system, and it's only used within the public sector. So apologies, that's a bit technical, but I think it's worth just being clear on what documentation you're looking at. So that's my point, is whatever you get, make sure you're clear on what you're looking at, and ensure that you answer all those questions specifically and in a detailed way. And that will make sure you don't trip up in terms of the process. Okay, so let's look at the typical tender documents you get within a tender pack, because there's a lot of information. And it will typically contain these sorts of areas. So there'll be an introduction, there'll be a bit of information on what the council are looking for, what the service is, why they're doing it. So for example, with Branduin, we're typically supporting councils' community wealth building strategy. And it's all about helping the councils to build stronger local supply chains. There'll be the tender conditions, and that's all the legal framework and parameters surrounding the tender. And then there'll be the detailed spec. That's the description of the services, the work, whatever it is they're asking you to supply. So read that bit carefully. Just stepping back 1 minute, I know in my banking days when I used to get these packs, they're often quite thick, with a lot of information. And what I would typically do is I just take myself away into a quiet room and metaphorically put a towel around my head and then just go through the document and highlight all the key points. So I encourage you perhaps to do something similar. So going back to the detail, there'll then be some instructions for the tender submission about timelines and process and different stages. You'll then have your qualitative tender response, and they're the detailed questions that you need to answer in terms of your offer, in terms of your service, in terms of your product. There'll always be a pricing and a delivery schedule. So, clearly you need to answer that. You need to talk about and make sure you charge the right price rather than the cheapest. And we'll touch a bit more about that in a minute. And also how you'll deliver, how you'll implement. There'll be a form of tender, which is a declaration that you need to sign as a potential supplier to say you've read all the details and terms and conditions. And then there'll be what's called a certificate of non-collusion. And that's a declaration that you as a bidder sign to say you haven't joined force, you basically submitted your tender independently, unless of course it's a consortium bid. And then finally, there'll typically be a draft of the proposed contract, which ultimately will be signed by the successful supplier. There may also be an SLA, a service level agreement as well. So there's a lot of documentation there. And the key message I'm trying to get across to you there is read it carefully, take your time, make sure you understand all the things that you're being asked for before you start getting into the writing bit. Okay, I'm just going to check the Q&A because there's a question in the Q&A. Being registered on local authority, yes. Okay, there's a question about technical question about DPS, and we'll touch upon that either later, or you can contact me directly, and we'll have a chat about that. Right. Okay. So let's look at the ITT requirements in detail. And with the councils, with local authorities, there are two key areas that they are looking to assess. They're looking at, firstly, the suitability of any prospective supplier. And that's very important for councils because there's a reputational risk for them because they need to be seen to be dealing with suppliers of a certain standing and credibility. And then there's what's called, I guess, the methodology. You'll have come across the term method statement, which can seem to cause a degree of stress and concern because people aren't sure quite what they are or what needs to go in them. Well, we'll talk a bit more about that. So I'll just run through some of those issues in terms of suitability first of all, and then we'll look at the method statement. So there'll often be mandatory reasons for excluding a particular supplier. So there'll be things like if you or your company have committed fraud, crime, money laundering, you've got barred directors, there's been director misconduct. These sort of things, if you answer yes in the tender submission at the outset, you will be automatically removed from the process because, of course, as I said, the local authority have a reputational risk there. Hopefully that does not apply to your businesses. Then there'll be some what are called discretionary exclusions, where the council have the option as to whether or not what you said is grounds for excluding you from the tender process. An example there might be, there may have been county court judgments, CCJs, against a director, but they've been repaid. In that situation, the council can decide, okay, is that something that's acceptable to us, or is it something that we feel really isn't what we want to deal with in terms of a supplier? They'll ask you financial information about your company. Often you'll see a minimum turnover size that the council will specify they feel is appropriate for a supplier to have in order to deliver the requirements they need. And they will say, well, okay, if your turnover is below that threshold, then as it says, it may be rejected. I mean, in that sort of instance, for example, if the minimum threshold, for example, is 100,000 and your company turnover is 90, I would say, absolutely still go ahead and bid if you feel you can put together a strong bid and you can meet the requirements. If, however, for example, your turnover of your company is 10,000 and your minimum threshold is 100, then realistically, they're probably saying your company's a bit small to bid in isolation. So in that case, you might want to think about joining forces with a different supplier. They'll ask you questions about your turnover. They'll ask you about your financial year end, of course. They'll ask you to confirm your bankers, perhaps your accountants, that sort of thing. And also for slightly larger SMEs, typically limited companies, they may run a credit check on your organization. And that's something that's done externally by credit reference agencies. The rating is typically low, medium, high. And again, the council will have the option to reject companies who are either receiving a medium or high risk rating. But again, that's at their discretion. So there'll be a lot of typically financial information. They'll also ask about your insurance requirements. These are typical insurance requirements always specified in local authority tenders: employer liability, public liability, professional indemnity insurance, and they will state the level of cover you need to have. I was at an event a few weeks ago where essentially someone asked, well, if I hold the cover already, do I score better than someone who doesn't hold the cover but says they're willing to obtain that level of cover if successful? And the answer there was no. So the point I'm making there is, if you don't hold the appropriate level of insurance cover, it's not a problem, providing you are prepared to put that level of cover in place if you are successful. And then finally, they'll ask you if there are any additional reasons why you feel you cannot compete the performance of the contract if you were successful. So there might be practical considerations. You might be able to meet the requirements, absolutely no problem, but you've got another large contract you're working on at the moment, so you don't have capacity. Or there might be an issue, for example, with a key member of staff who's sick. So they'll ask you up front to say, okay, Is there anything else that we need to be aware of as council that will stop you from fulfilling the contract terms? Okay, so let's look a little bit about these, what are called technical method statements. This is where you build up your tender response in more detail. It's where you talk about what service you're going to deliver, how you're going to deliver it, what's your planning process, what's the management structure, what's your experience of similar contracts, are you proposing to run the contract yourself? So this, as I said, this is from a real live example of a business support and training program that Branduin submitted a tender for and won. So let's just run through some of those things. And you'll see on the right of the slide, there's a weighting column. I'm sure you know what that means. And it basically shows the level of importance that the council gives to various sections. So clearly, the higher weighting, they give more of an importance. So initially, they'll talk about service delivery. How are you going to deliver the service in question based on what the council have asked you to do? And this was a business support program, so they asked us, give us an overview of the training you're going to provide, a breakdown of the modules for each course, how you're going to mitigate risks and challenges. So, we run various webinars like this, and as you'll hopefully have seen, there's a summary of what we do, who's doing it, why they are capable of doing it. In terms of risks and challenges, we run events face-to-face, typically when we can, now post-COVID. The last one we tried to do on a contract I was running with came on a day of a train strike, so we had to then move it to online and run it via Zoom. So you need to talk about how you're going to deliver the service and how you're going to address risks and challenges. They'll ask for details of your mobilization plan. That's a technical term for saying, how are you going to do it? It's all well and good you saying you can provide this service, you can provide this product, but how are you going to actually deliver it? What are the milestones? Who's responsible? What are the timelines? Who's responsible? Have you got it all nicely plotted out on a nice Gantt chart or an Excel spreadsheet? How can you demonstrate that you can deliver what you say? Because again, it all adds weight to your proposal. They'll then ask about details of the management structure. Who's going to manage the program? What are their qualifications? Are they competent? Who are the key people who deliver on the actual contract? What are the business continuity arrangements? As you can see, there's a higher weighting on that. So it's an important part for you to address quite clearly. So do follow that and put enough information in there. They'll then ask about experience that your organization has had in delivering typically similar services. So in this case, it was like, what experience have you had, Branduin, in delivering business support services? As you can see, both online and face-to-face. And what training did you do? And what have you done with different organizations in the last 3 years? That slide that I told you took us 12 years to produce. We've got case studies as Branduin for most of those different contracts, and things like the contract value and how we added value and what we did well and what we could improve on, all those good things. So the point I'm making is do that with your own organizations as well. Build up your bank of knowledge and case studies, because it'll all help make sure your bids are much stronger. Then it asks us about business engagement. How are we going to work with a wide range of SMEs? How are we going to encourage them to take part in the program? What's our background? What's our experience in working with communities, for example, facing economic decline, perhaps uncertainty? What results did we achieve? Were they successful? Did we meet the contract values? Did we meet the clear outcomes achieved? So, for example, in the contract I've just been working on in Hammersmith, they had a set number of webinars we had to run, a set number of companies we had to put through the program, and you need to make sure you meet and you can demonstrate you will meet all those different output criteria. They asked about equality. How has our company engaged with Black, Asian, minority SME companies, for example? How do we get them to engage in programs that sometimes perhaps they may feel excluded from? And then finally, they'll talk about the London living wage often, because they want to be working with companies who are, I don't know if ethical is the right word, but do pay staff a living wage, because we all know how tough it is at the moment with the cost of living crisis and the price of everything seeming to go only one way, and that's up. So there's a lot of information there which is required to build your technical method statement. And like I said, keep your eye on the weighting and make sure you focus your efforts more on those areas which are more heavily weighted. Even simple things like word counts. In council contracts, they'll often give you a word count restriction. So they'll say you've got 500 words for this section. So, you know, you don't have to write exactly 500 words, but, you know, if you're writing 200, 300 words, you're probably missing something. So follow the instructions carefully and make sure you include everything that's relevant. Okay, just have a quick look at the chat because I can see another question. No, that's all fine. That's okay. Right. Okay. So that moves us on to MEET, and it stands for Most Economically Advantageous Tender. And this basically allows the local authority to take account of the criteria that's a combination of quality and price. And it's how they technically depending on the type of service. So on the first bullet point, you'll basically see that it's 75% price. So it might be a more commoditized service. So use an example, it might be a cleaning contract. And the local authority may have taken the view that they believe most cleaners can clean. And so, you know, quality is low, but the price weighting is actually high. So the focus there is lowest price wins. However, in the second example, in the second bullet point, it's saying actually quality is really important. 75% of weighting is on quality, and the price isn't quite so important. So that's more a case of like, you know, these business support programs that we get involved with, where they're saying, yeah, of course, we want to get a competitive price, but realistically, the focus is on quality. And if you can provide a high quality service and demonstrate that, then the price is a secondary issue. You can see down the right in the box, there's a variety of assessment criteria for quality. Assessment criteria, the quality of your service, yes, pricing, your technical ability to deliver, the
Hello everyone, it looks like Noshir is just having some technical difficulties. He will be back in a moment, just please hold on.
Right, Lisa, can you just give me a sign or a message in the chat that you can hear? Because I think the internet went down.
Yes, you are back. We can hear and see you.
Oh, that's wonderful. Let me just reshare my screen. Sorry, give me 1 second. Technology is great when it works, and generally does, but it also has some challenges. So just bear with me for 30 seconds, people, please. Right, Lisa, sorry, before you leave, can you see that screen okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, sorry about that, people. Welcome back. Had a bit of a technical issue there. So like I was just saying, it's a very methodical process for analysing and scoring tenders by the local authority. So let's look a little bit more about evaluation processes. And with local authorities, as I said, you'll invariably be dealing with a procurement department, and procurement departments are evaluators. They're people from within the council whose job is literally to evaluate and process the tenders, not necessarily the end users of the services, but people who are managing the tender process. And they will use an evaluation methodology, something like this. There's not a standard process, but essentially they'll score your responses, and they'll do it in a methodical way by literally looking at the question and then looking at your answer. And of course, as a business, you should be striving for those excellent or good ratings. And you'll see that to get those higher ratings, you need to go over and above. You need to exceed the required standard. You need to make sure you've answered the questions fully. You've provided innovative responses. You've demonstrated how you can add value. I talk a lot more about this and how to do that in my previous webinar, so have a look at that if you can. And of course, if you've scored poorly, you'll see you provided an inadequate response, you haven't given enough detail, you might have answered the question properly, it's not relevant, the answer you've given. So do look very carefully at your responses and strive to hit those 4 and 5 ratings to give yourself the best possible chance to win. So let's just have a quick look at a tender timetable. And like I said, the local authority timetables are quite structured. This is the actual timetable from the tender that Branduin submitted. And as you can see, at the outset, they'll publish the tender back in July. There'll be some time for perhaps site visits, some clarifications. There'll be a submission deadline, of course. And as you'll see on the slide on the right, read that timetable carefully and make sure you're crystal clear about the deadlines. Don't leave it to the last minute. I was at a presentation a few weeks ago from Luton Airport, who said that they had a deadline of midday, and essentially they were getting calls at 2 minutes to 12 from companies saying, it won't upload, it won't upload. Do it the day before. Make sure you always work to the day before. Plan well in advance. You'll see then there's an evaluation period, and the local authority will then announce a shortlist, who will then be asked to come and present. And then there'll be the notice of award and the contract start date. That's actually quite an aggressive timetable for a local authority, and typically, quite often, these timetables do slip. Sometimes it's just outside the local authority's control. So make sure you're crystal clear on what those timings are, and you plan well in advance so you don't come up against deadlines and then find you haven't got enough time. It is always about thinking about it carefully in advance. Okay, so let's have a look at basically, with the tendering process, every local authority is trying to get a job done. Try and always put yourself in the mind of the buyer, of the local authority. Focus on what the buyer wants, not on what you want to sell, because that can be quite tempting. You've got various products and services, the question's been asked by the authority, and you think, well, I'll just tell them everything we do and some of it will stick. No, that's not a good approach. Like it says in the diagram, try and define your offer around what jobs they need to do, what customer needs do they have, what outcomes are unmet where you can help. And then you can see and find opportunities and hopefully build a winning strategy and develop a winning bid. So put yourself in the mindset of the local authority. Right, well, I've been doing a lot of talking, so it's about time you did a little bit of thinking and a little bit of work. I did say it was interactive. So what I'd like you to do now is just for a minute or so, I appreciate there's not a lot of time, is think about and write down what you do in your own business and then explain how it'll meet the desired outcome for the local authority. How will it help the local authority achieve what they're trying to get, what they're trying to deliver? What problem will it solve? What need will it satisfy? And keep your mind on what are the big picture outcomes. So to give you an example, I don't know, a big picture outcome or strategy might be to increase the percentage of Black and Asian minority ethnic employees. So that would be an outcome. And the job that they're trying to get done could be improve, change, or remodel their recruitment process. So big picture, improve and increase Black, Asian, minority, ethnic employees, job to be done, remodel the recruitment process. So just spend a minute or so thinking about that from the perspective of your own business. Because like I said, if you can put yourself in the local authority mindset and understand how you can help them solve a job, that's going to put you in a strong position. So I'll give you a minute to think about that. If you want to put anything in the chat, you're welcome to, but if not, just write something down for your own benefit, because it will help you in terms of your thought process. Just give you a moment for that. And do think about, like I said, from both a functional, like a day-to-day perspective, and in terms of their strategic goals. This sounds obvious, but when you're doing this, always talk about benefits, how you can add value, how your offer, how your product, how your service will help them get a job done, help them solve a problem. Don't talk about features. And always remember, however you offer your service, you need to be adaptable to fit your offer to the local authority's process, because they won't adapt. So you need to be flexible and thoughtful about that too. So I'll just give you 30 seconds more to jot something down on that. Okay, well, hopefully it's given you a chance to give that some thought. I appreciate there's not a lot of time, but do think about that in your own time as well, because it's a useful process to go through. So I want to touch here briefly on something that comes from a business technique called the business model canvas. I don't know if you've come across that. If you haven't, I would recommend you Google it, because it's a very it's a very succinct way of analyzing a business on one sheet of paper, and it looks at the internal challenges, external challenges, and the financial viability of your business. So if you've not done that on your own business, I would certainly recommend you do that. And the sort of things that it will talk about are these various 5 lenses. So your offer needs to be desirable to your customers. If they don't want your offer, then clearly, you're not going to have any sales. Whatever you offer, you need to be able to deliver and implement it in a way that's feasible. So you need to be able to demonstrate your implementation process. It needs to be financially viable. As I said, I was talking to a business last week on a one-to-one, and very briefly, she was bidding for a contract where the contract value to me seemed quite low in relation to what she was being asked to provide. So I did challenge her and say, is there enough margin in this for you? Are you going to make a sufficient profit? Because, we're in this to make money ultimately. Yes, we want to provide a service, but it needs to be financially viable. This point about adaptability, it's key. The other thing that you need to be thinking about, I'm sure some of you are, is the sustainability of your business. A crucial issue. So what's the purpose? What's the impact of what you do on the planet, on society? This is not a climate change seminar, but at the same time, you need to think about that very carefully. I think as it currently stands, we can't just overlook purpose, because there are so many environmental and economic, ecological challenges now that you need to have some thought of that when you're developing your offer, your strategy, your service. So do give that some thought. So next little exercise for you to go through. You'll all have seen, or maybe even done, a SWOT analysis on your business. But what I want you to do here for a couple of minutes is think about it from the perspective of a tender. So again, jot a few things down. Think about how, if you're submitting tender, and what strengths you have, which will allow you to score more highly. What are your weaknesses where you can't perhaps meet certain criteria and score lower? What are the opportunities? What are the threats? Spend a few moments doing that and think quite carefully what you can do to add that value. Simple examples, a couple of businesses I've been talking to. One, they've got a really strong USP in my view. And USPs are interesting ones because people say, businesses, I say, what's a USP? They say, well, we provide a great customer service. Well, all businesses would say that. They don't say we provide poor service. But one business I spoke to, they've got more 5-star Google reviews than any of their competition. Well, that's unique. That's quite strong. So that would be a strength. Another lady I deal with, she's a florist, and somehow she's managed to get some really top tier names on her books. She's a one-man band at the moment, one-woman band, but she deals with real high-profile high street names. And again, having that in her bank of evidence, a real strength. So again, I'll give you a minute just to jot down some ideas and thoughts on that. And like I said with the earlier exercise, do spend a bit of time doing this yourselves after the event, because the more you plan, the more you think, the more you write things down, which will force you to think, the stronger your bid submission will be and the greater chance of success. So it might seem like hard work, but it's worth the effort if you want to bid and tender successfully, seriously, for local authority contracts. So a few more seconds for that, conscious of time, but we're doing well. Okay, I've got a little bit more to get through, so I'll move on. I'll leave you to do that in your own time, if I may. So I want to talk about social value. Again, a term you may have come across, but something that's got much greater profile and prominence in local authority tenders. And like it says in that first bullet, social value is improvements made to the social, economic, and environment well-being of a local area when tendering. So essentially, the local authority will be looking at broader things than just price. You know, how are you helping and benefiting the local community? How are you helping and thinking about how limited public resources might be used? And there's some examples of social value down the slide at the bottom. It could be simple things like providing jobs for local people. It might be that you're doing something to help the environment. It could be you're doing something in terms of climate change, net zero, providing opportunities to underprivileged workers or kids. I've got a business that I work with in Brent, and they provide training for young people trying to get themselves into business. Great. Working with a painter and decorator. And one of the things that he said as part of his tender bid was that he would paint the local community centre, which hadn't been painted, I think, for, I don't know, 5-10 years. We're looking a bit shabby. So make sure you've got a social value policy, because all local authority tenders were required to have certain policies in place, and social value will be one of them. It doesn't have to be a massively long document. It could be one page. Go on the internet, look at templates, and just make sure you've got a policy of some sort, so that when they're assessing your tender, they look at social value policy or business continuity or modern slavery or whatever it might be, because there are certain key policies you have to have. You don't get excluded because you just haven't got a policy. So important point to keep in mind. So here's a proverb for you. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So the point we're making there is, if you can't do everything yourself, think about joining forces. If you're anything like me, I think, well, you know, I can do things quicker and faster myself. I don't need anyone to help me. But actually, I know I can't do everything. I don't have experience in all the areas. So let's talk a little bit about consortium bidding. And it's defined as 2 or more organisations who can't individually meet all the requirements of the ITT. So you might think, I can do that bit of the tender, fantastic. But I'm not so good at that and that. So why not join forces with someone? And then together, you can put in a stronger bid. Things to keep in mind with consortium bidding is local authorities will only contract with one legal entity. So one member of the consortium has to act as a lead member, because that's who will be paid. And there are various different structures you can put in place. SPVs, partnership arrangements, or just a consortium of people with a lead partner nominated. Things to keep in mind: the legal arrangements, the decision-making, what's the governance around the consortium, who's going to manage it, what are the exit arrangements, are there any penalties, what are the penalties if partners don't meet their liabilities. But the key thing to also remember is, even if you've got 3 or 4 organisations coming together to put in a consortium bid, if the document has to read as one cohesive document, it has to read as if written by one person. And you can get external bid writers to look at that sort of thing for you to help you with that process. So if you feel you're either perhaps too small, or you feel perhaps that you can't do everything in a bid, but you'd be great at that part of it, do think about joining forces and putting in, bids that are, joining forces with a stronger or different type of player who can help you have produce a stronger submission. Okay, let's just touch briefly on existing suppliers, because I hear that in the market that people say, oh, once you've been appointed as a supplier, it's impossible to dislodge existing suppliers. It's not true. It's not impossible. It is hard. It's more difficult if the existing supplier is doing a good job. But here are just a few tips and suggestions to help you. So first of all, find out as much as you can about the existing supplier. Use data. Find out about how long they've worked with them, what products and services they're providing. What's the value of the contract, that sort of stuff. And you can find that information out in the market. Start building relationships well before the contract comes up for renewal. This is a long-term process. It's not a quick win. So you might be thinking, we want to submit a tender by the end of 2023. Well, start now. Start talking to the key players in the local authority now, understanding what's important to them. Make sure you've got a unique selling proposition that's bespoke to the local authority where you're bidding, the service they want. The one-size-fits-all approach won't work. And to break in, you might need to price your initial bid quite aggressively. I know that was a strategy we did in the bank. We were trying to break into the market. So you might give them a 6-month discount to get yourself and get your foot in the door. Like I said, you don't have to directly bid. You can join forces as well. And the other thing to remember with local authorities is that once you're involved with them, they tend to pay very promptly, providing you've met the agreed standards. So that has a positive impact on your cash flow as well. So once you're in, they pay promptly, and providing you do a good job, you should hopefully have a stronger position when the contracts are up for renewal. Just a few tips to get you started. I've covered a lot of information here, and there's a lot of things to think about. But in terms of starting, start with a specific sector. Think about your value proposition. If you don't know what that is, we do run webinars on that as well. It takes time and effort, so focus your effort where you can get maximum return. Like I said, subcontract if you can, if you need to. Think big, but start with smaller contracts. The smaller contracts don't have as much process typically, and it allows you to get a feel for the process. Look out for niche opportunities, so get registered for tender alerts, go to networking events, go to exhibitions, meet the buyer events, those sort of things, and think about how you can differentiate yourself, whether that's through a strong social value policy or whether it's a very unique selling proposition. And ultimately, like I said, it takes time and effort. So don't just think, can we do it? Think, can you win it? Because that's the ultimate driver, isn't it? Can you win the business? Okay, so to summarize, with any tender, particularly also with local authorities, these are the key issues to remember. Make sure you've satisfied all the terms of the ITT. You've answered that why you question. What's different about you? What's your story? Have you provided strong evidence? Have you focused your efforts on the customer? Remember, it's all about them. It's not about you. Does your solution talk about benefits, value you can add? Is it priced correctly? Is it professionally written? Is it consistent? Is it easy to understand? Succinct but complete. And have you made it easier for the evaluators by making sure you've answered the questions concisely and clearly and provided evidence to back up what you're saying? All this is covered in much more detail in my initial webinar, so spend some time on that if you need to. Because if you can cover all those points, you're going to be well on the way to submitting a winning bid. Okay, little sip of water. Just want to spend literally 5 minutes now on real opportunities from Hounslow Council. So you can see here that the council will be contracting through the procurement process over the next 18, 24 months for £500 million of tendering projects. So there's a lot of work out there. It's just about getting it. And you can see a little breakdown there. 55% of the projects are, development, housing, construction, and then 36% are services and 9% goods. There's a little chart there which shows a little bit more about the breakdown. There's a strong element of construction. The red section is other services. It doesn't include social care because that's slightly different. They're often contracted individually. But there's a lot of business out there. And for you, the key is to find out what's the relevant service that they want that I can help with my business. So how do you find out? Well, firstly, you can get registered on the tender portal. So Hounslow, they use londontenders.org, and that's where they advertise their opportunities. It's used by a number of London boroughs. And as you can see, in the last quarter, nearly 90% of contracts were available through the tendering process. Some of the lower value contracts are sent to specific suppliers. For example, when they're under £75,000, they're sent to a set limited number of suppliers, and the commissioning officer can invite certain suppliers to actually send in a tender. And below smaller values, they can often appoint a supplier without going to formal tender. So start to understand the process. Make sure you get registered on the relevant portals, and there are various other ones that you might also want to get access to. As you can see at the bottom, Contracts Finder, which all public bodies use. Just a quick summary on what's available for you on the programme. A lot of these events have taken place, but like I said, they're mainly recorded on the West London Chamber YouTube channel. We ran a very successful Meet the Buyer event last month at the Holiday Inn in Brentford. Nearly 60 businesses, some great feedback, an open Q&A session, got the chance to meet senior people within the council, got the chance to meet senior procurement people, and there's representatives from Heathrow as well. So, get yourself to these networking and business engagement events, because again, it's sometimes difficult to get hold of people in the council or senior people, but they'll be there at these events. Once you've met them, then, you've got a greater chance of getting to know them, following up with an email. So a number of things that, as I said, you can do. We've got one coming up on the 23rd of March, which is basically all about the circular economy. And like I said earlier, that's all about global challenges like climate change, waste, reducing pollution, recycling, sustainability, how to better use resources. And you might think as a small business, I haven't got time for all that. But actually, everyone can make a difference in some small way. Just to finish off, I'm conscious we're just about up in terms of time. We've got these tender one-to-one advice sessions. It's a very structured process. It's a very structured, proven, dare I say, successful process. We have great feedback from the SMEs that go through it. And essentially, you'll have a session with a specialist who will look at your key bidding and tendering challenges. We'll talk through some of the challenges that you have and then come up with an action plan for you to work on. So it's not a bit of a cozy chat just to sort of see how your business is doing. It's a focused action, task, outcome-based session with clear, definable, agreed tasks for you to carry on after the session to take you and your business forward. They're fully funded by the council, so get yourself on those sessions if you haven't done so already. And the way to do that is to essentially contact Charlie, my colleague. There is details up on the screen. He's managing this project on behalf of Branduin, and the whole idea is he'll get you booked on a session, then get you more confident in submitting what are called expressions of interest, and then hopefully get you to a point where you can develop winning bids, both for the council and in the private sector. Okay, and the final thing, like I said, is what are you going to do about it? You've sat here, thankfully, most of you for an hour and hopefully found it useful and interesting, but think about what are you going to do as a result of what you've heard. So I'm going to stay here for the next sort of few minutes, 3 or 4 minutes. Please feel free to put something in the chat as to what's your one action that you're going to do. It might be something as simple as Google Business Model Canvas. It might be to complete the SWOT analysis. It might be to look at the last webinar that you didn't get a chance to see. What are you going to do to help you move your business forward? So thank you so much for taking time out of what are clearly your busy days. Sorry about the slight technical hitch, but thankfully Lisa saved me on that one. If you want to put any feedback in the chat in terms of how you found the session, good or bad, I've got broad shoulders. I can take all sort of feedback. And I hope you found this useful in terms of at least giving you a bit of a better idea of how to start making successful bids within the public sector. Because like I said at the outset, it's only difficult and a secret when you don't know how to do it. So I'm hoping this has given you some tips and ideas. Okay, well, thanks again. As I say, do put some comments in the chat if you want, and yeah, be happy to take those. Thanks, Alma. Thanks, Chloe. Thanks to Dulce. I'm glad you found it useful. I know there was a technical question about dynamic purchasing systems at the outset. I'll put my email in the chat. If you want to contact me directly, you can do that after. Thanks, Al. Well, good. I'm glad you found it useful, because I like to feel that if you spent an hour of your busy day listening to someone talking about stuff that has had some value, and like I said, if you don't want to put anything in the chat here about what your one action is, that's fine, but make that commitment and do something yourself, because otherwise, why'd you bother listening to this for an hour? You've got to do something different as a result. So I'll stay here for another minute or so. Other than that, I wish you all a great day. And hope you have success with your bidding and tendering. Obviously, do get in touch with Charlie as well if you want to get yourself on those one-to-one sessions, which I think run to the end of March. So don't wait too long. Oh, Ashwani, I think, has asked something about future Meet the Buyer events. I'm not aware of any schedule at the moment, but certainly if you keep an eye on Eventbrite, they're always advertised on Eventbrite, and as long as you're on the mailing list, you'll get details of all the future events. Okay, well, I'll just give it another 30 seconds if anyone's got any last minute feedback, questions, or comments. And other than that, we'll shut things down and wish you all well. Oh, yep, someone wants a phone number, so hang on a second. I'll just pop my number in there as well. That's my number in there, Ashwani, but certainly if there's anything particular on this program, I would contact Charlie as a first port of call, but you can get to Charlie via me. So whatever's easiest, but Charlie's running with this program. Right. Okay. There's some questions around emails. I've put my email, I've put my phone number. So yeah, people want to get in touch with me or Charlie, then we'll be happy to answer any future questions that you might have around the bidding and tendering process. Right. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for your time and attendance. Like I said, hope you found it useful. And yeah, we'll look forward to seeing you at future events, and have a great day. Okay. All the best, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.